The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I'm the TrainingPeaks WKO4 product leader. For those of you who know the process here, can you type in the question box if you can hear me and if you're seeing my screen? Always helps me make sure. I have a brand new microphone, one of this like fancy open desk microphones. So if you hear me like cracking open a couple of beers or something like that, I might get exposed, but hopefully it'll make the sound a little bit better for you. Last time I had a little bit of problems. I really think it was kind of just an older microphone. So I'll try to keep the volume right. And yep, and the screen is running. All right, I'm stalling a little bit as people are still rolling in. Great attendance. Wow, always a pleasure. All right, let's get started. Right off the bat, one of the things I want to make sure everybody knows how to do is to ask questions. My panel looks a little different than yours, but I figured, it's going to be pretty close. You have this side panel over here. You can open and close it by this arrow. If you find your question area, you can open your question area by setting the little down arrow. You can see your questions here. You can actually type them in here. Just click till you find the point you can type. I have a second screen, and I'll be following questions as you go. I really encourage the questions. More now I'm showing some general ideas, and this will be a general idea format, but I don't mind kind of tackling and answering the questions as we go. I did put today's presentation in the drag and drop. My side says drag and drop. Yours probably says handouts right here. You can download today's presentation as a PDF whenever you want at the beginning or end. And I'm pretty sure it'll email it to you when it's done, said and done. So that's just a way to answer questions. Before we get started, my kind of constant, I guess, pre-warning, the stuff that we're going to go over is my opinion. Part of the reason we designed WKO4 and something I'm a big believer in is I don't think you should ever take everything as absolute. There's a lot of art and science to coaching. I think, you can utilize WKO4 to kind of test and vet and find what works for you. I'm going to share some of my processes and opinions. I'm going to show you some of the things I do. To be honest with you, and today I'm not showing everything. I'm just going to try to give you a good core of some ideas and teach a little bit as we go, but it's still my opinion, my way. My main push for this presentation is for you to develop your own process. I highly recommend for coaches that you make a process in certain functions within your job. Reviewing race information files and stuff like that is certainly a part of it. So if you have a process that acts as the core, that would really help you. For me, this process I've learned over time, you really need to build it by sport type or race type. As always, you end up with different chart sets for kind of different functions. I did share the charts. What you'll see now should be going into the library as we speak, but you're going to have to wait to see what their names, well, they'll have the little highlights on them. Don't forget, if you don't see them in the library, you have to sync to get them. And you'll see I have like some at the workout level, road race and time trial and things like that. You have to adapt each review to the race. So in this particular set, I'm going to show you some general ideas, but when you do it, and I'll talk about points where that adaptation has to occur, but you have to adapt to the race itself. So there's certain features in the race. If there's certain challenges, you just need to adapt to it, tweak and edit what you're tracking. And I'll give some examples of what I mean. Same for the rider. You got to look at what the rider's doing. You can't always have the same tracking, the same review for the same riders. It is a repetitive view, though. You're kind of looking at the same stuff. One of the things, though, is that happens when you set up a repetitive view. Sometimes you forget to really stop searching for those little extra tidbits of data. I did a webinar, I don't know, about 2 years ago. I think Andy and I did it. It was about, the treasure hunt of data. And it was like a couple of slides, like a treasure map kind of deal. Don't forget, when you see things that raise an eyebrow and create a question, don't be afraid to go a little deeper, and try to figure out what's happening. Mine the data and learn. So I tried to summarize my process a little bit. My process really is, I guess, a two-step process. So it's funny, whenever you talk about race file and looking at somebody's race performance, the file is just the numbers, right, to that performance. You really have to think about their race readiness. You can't just jump in and look at a file and say, oh, here's what power they did, and here's what speed they were going, or something like that. You really have to understand the environment that that race occurred in. In this case, the environment I'm talking about is their race readiness. So when I review a race, I have a set of charts that are really a 30-day lead-in. I really focus on the 30 days. And you might say, well, Tim, why not longer? Well, the reality is it's always longer. I'm always looking at season reviews and PMC and building and all the things you're doing. But when I really want to look at this race and how the athlete did, I need to understand the microcycle leading up to it. And I just capture that as 30 days and a couple of tricks, which I'm going to show you. When it comes to the race review, I have a couple of steps, and I'll go over them, but I do prep segments I'll talk about. Don't forget, because I said it, so I'll say it again here, that also in the race review, think about the environmental data. What was the environment of the race? But I'll get into it when we get there. So let's break it out. Let's separate these two. Let's start with race readiness. So I loaded one of my race readiness packs. This is my core one. I keep this as a master, but I tend to adapt it a lot for individual athletes. I tried to make it like one that I could really use well, but I always end up with a bunch of custom information. It's called Race Readiness. At the athlete level, it was loaded for you. Excuse me while I take a drink. I didn't even have to crack that beer. It was already open. So Race Readiness is loaded. I do it as a pack because I'm using the parent-child relationship in times. The one I'm going to demo here, I'm actually going to demo two, but I'll probably spend a lot more time going over the first one so you understand what I did. Here's a quick look at a one-day racer. Let's call this Jane Ryder. This one-day racer is a classic North American racer, female pro, kind of setting up for the continental race season here. What's funny in my 30-day lead-in, and I have to say this in advance, is I didn't have a great example. I'm going to have to explain why a little bit. If you look at the charts, all of them, I bind a lot of them by athlete range, which I'm going to talk about here in a moment, to the 30 days leading up to the event. And then I have a trick for capturing that data. But now that I kind of placed this webinar slightly in advance of race season, I only have one athlete kind of racing right now over in Europe. The other two are kind of in the North American circuit. I didn't have a perfect example. So I'm going to have to kind of fake it a little bit here. So just bear with me, but it'll work out pretty well. Now what I'm doing in this chart, right, is I'm using some unique functions. So here you simply have a CTL, and it's athlete range 30 days. So you can pick whatever. It's only going to show you 30 days. And you see a CTL with a little bit of shading. I know in these webinars the shading always looks pretty gray, but it's there. And you notice here, though, that I have a red dashed line, then a yellow dashed line, and then a green dashed line overlaid over my blue. All I'm doing is taking the full 30 days is the blue, the past 7 days is the green, the previous 7 before that is yellow, and then the previous 14 before that is red. So I don't really mean anything by the red, yellow, green. It's my brain of counting down, go time. But what I am doing here, and this is something that people are starting to figure out more and more, and I think is a very helpful trick. You can see I have a dashed red line, which I kick myself for not making these thicker. Sorry. And you can see the angle of it right here. And then you can see the yellow line right here, and you can see the green line right here. And all I'm doing is running a simple linear regression, a trend line for those phases, right? Because you could run one trend line over the CTL as an example here for the 30 days, and that trend line would go up is my guess. The reality is when I break my 30 days into last week, previous 2 weeks, we see a different story. And as you begin to think about athletes with big single events or big primary goal events, this really gives you some insight into your final taper. And you could take this out as long as you taper, if you're tapering more than 30 days, if you taper. And when I say taper, a taper isn't always just down, down, down. There's plenty of ways to accomplish a taper, but it gives you good insight at the CTL level. Down here I'm doing TSB. And what I'm doing with the TSB, there's some color coding, and you're not, again, I'm going to kick myself here. There's two different reds you might see. And all I'm doing is, one, there's a regular TSB number. When it's red, when it's light red, you can see these two reds up here. When it's dark red, it's TSB TR, and when it's light red, it's TSB TT. These are my secret code words for TSB to rested and TSB too tired. It's that fancy, right? And if you'll notice here, I have an optimal line I'm targeting for an athlete, and I always set it at -10, so I am just using a default setting. I'll target it specifically for an athlete, but I'll show you that in a moment. The reality is I'm also doing the same with TSB as I did here with trend lines. So you see I have a red dash trend line for 14 days out, then a previous week, so 8 to 14 days out, and then here for the previous week. So you get a pretty good TSB story going right here, right? You have a subtle gain. This athlete took a deep push, and let's say today was the race day. This athlete you can clearly see is resting into race day pretty aggressively. So that ability to separate those linear regressions gives us a different insight than what the whole trend line would give us. And that's something I look at the lead-in. Now, crazy as it is, two people asked me about the SLR function today. So I added this slide, and I'm just going to do this because I need to do more of this, not just teach the answer, teach how to do it. We all can't just ask William Renfro to build us charts online. We have to build some our own some days. So if you think about what SLR is, it really is a simple linear regression or a line function. An equation of a line is y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. So if you think about WKO4 functions, and there's more than I have listed here, but these are three core ones, you have SLR function, that gives you the whole line. That gives you the whole line. You have SLRM function, that just gives you the m or the slope of the line. And if you use SLRB function, it gives you the b or the intercept. What's the y-intercept of the line? So for an example, you could use SLR TSS as the whole trend line, right? But SLRM TSS is the slope, and SLRB TSS, and that tends to be a little more complex, is the intercept. Now I'm teaching those because I'm going to show you. I actually use all those in my prep, so I figured while I showed you SLR, I'll show you them all. How I did this time ranging is I simply bound them by athlete range. So I built an equation, athlete range, today -7 to today, and I'm doing CTL, and then I'm just taking the simple linear regression of that. So that's how I built those lines. Now, of course, I gave you the charts. You can use them, but that's a little insight into how to use the simple linear functions, the line functions. Okay, the next thing I have in that pack is I have a RR, road race readiness report. So race readiness for my road racing, so I call it all RR. Again, I'm only looking at the last 30 days. These are time bound. So I am looking at the current CTL, the current TSB, and then in the last 30 days, I look at high volume rides, and in this case, I'm using my base is always 2,500 kilojoules, and high intensity rides where the IF is more than 8.5. So again, you can see this is probably not an athlete about ready to race. We're not seeing a lot of intensity, but it just an example. Yours will work for you. Last 30 days, we can see the TSS. Remember, this athlete was resting aggressively, is 285. I'm going to look here. The TSS for the 30 days, pretty solid training block. This athlete's kind of picking it up and getting moving. Now, what I do, right, is I run a slope. So here's where I am using the SLR or the various different SLR functions because it really just gives us this slope. And I'm just kind of looking at the equation for you. And here's where again, think about SLRM. It is going to give you the slope rating. Slope you can do as a percentage a lot, but it's usually better to just look at it really what it is. Percentage can be a little misleading. Slope is simply just changeover unit, what the slope is. So here, this person, because they're resting, they're actually have a pretty steep slope in the last 7 days. They're getting positive, the linear rate of 65 TSS a day. Well, if you looked at the week, the athlete rested Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and is only just kind of getting back into training when I took the screenshot. So that would make sense. That being said, I set a slope target for my athletes for race. 5 is my default. So I just put the number in there. I do it based on some history, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But I just place the number in there. I used to automate it, but I separated the automation so I remember to really think about it and put some answers in there because it's tough to automate, too many variables. But I'll show you what I mean by automate. And then I'm running the same slope over 30 days. Here, over a full 30 days of training, we see something more normal. This athlete, when you look at all the gain and then the rest, they've actually they have a little bit of negative slope. They gained a little more than they rested over the time period. I do look at work for the last 7 days and 30 days. And again, just high volume rides, it's the same equation. I just use it twice. Now here's where I might get a little unique. I look at power at VO2 max for the last 30 days. To me, I think that particularly we get in race season, and it depends, right? If you're one big event versus a professional going into a very big season, you tend to approach it slightly different. A lot of people don't have one big event, but a couple of big events. I want to track that power at VO2 max. One, I want to know it, but more importantly, I want to know the trend of it. So you see here, this athlete in the 30 days really hasn't moved their power at VO2 max. They have a decent VO2 max. And if you look at the model, so here I'm running a slope on the model, there's been a minor improvement in the model. It just hasn't translated to power yet. So this athlete is not driving maximal aerobic power. It really isn't an area of focus. That being said, because volume has gone up and they're doing something, you would hope this has moved. But yet, to some degree, it really hasn't. Other information I use, and I started to reorder it to try to make sense to everybody, but, sometimes it's just better to show you what happens in my brain. So I'm sorry, it's probably scary to show you what happens in my brain, but it's easier for me to present and think about it. I run the top 10 FTPs divided by CTL, so it's a cross function. There's actually a chart that does this. Just I think that's the name of it. FTP CTL, top FTP CTL. I just run the equation, and I want to know over the last 2 years. So here I'm reaching back, right? When was their top 10 performance, or top 10 MFTPs probably would be a better description. And when they had those top 10, what was their CTL at the time? And then take an average of those top 10. Well, their CTL as an average of the top 10 was 82. And here we're at the athlete at a 98. This athlete is a younger athlete who just got out of school and is really now kind of committing to living the dream, so is making some changes. So, their last 2 years, you would expect it to be low, but it still gives us insight of where they were having peaks. We're probably going to make some new, paradigms and some new shifts this year. And then here I'm doing the same top 10 FTP at their TSB for the last 2 years, and they've had their best performances when they're pretty much zero, when they're flat. They're not too rested, they're not too fresh at -1. So that gives me some insight of what I might be looking for here in the current data. I just kind of do a comparison. I could put a line and run some variances, but I don't know. I just intuitively look at that way. You can easily put variances to where they're actually at to the best. Next line, I'm just looking at some peak numbers. So what I do here is I look at their max in the last 30 days. So this athlete has a 1 minute max of 358 watts. The peak 1 minute max, when you see T3, that's top 3. I try to always keep my header short for the last 30 days. So the average of their top 3 is 335. Historically, their peak 1 minute. So here's 2 years. Their top 10 for 2 years is 420. So this athlete is 85 watts down. They're at peak 3 right now to their peak 10 over 2 years. So they haven't been doing any short hard. There's a reason for this. It was probably a bad athlete to use now that I think about it. But they're really off on that area, soon to change. Then I have the same for 20 minutes at 291 at peak, 261 at the recent top 3 average, 281 at the 2-year top 10 average, so about 20 watts down off of that. The reality is this athlete is not race ready, as you can see. But as you get race ready, obviously you'd love to see that be the same, if not better, right? It would give you some excellent indication of that athlete's performance readiness and, ability to kind of jump in. To me, I always come back to clusters. Now, here's a note, right, about customization. Max, I showed the example of 1 and 20 minutes. I would really think about the event specificity here. So let's say you had a time trialer who had a trialist that had a big event, and you knew it was going to take them approximately 45 minutes. Use 45 minutes. Or maybe you're doing a lot of your training and preparation for that 45 minutes is 2 times 25. Use 25 minutes. Or maybe it's a road racer where there's a very important feature, a 6-minute climb on the way up, in the major day. You might want to track 6-minute power. So here's where I would do a lot of customization to the rider and to the event. If you were tackling a significant limiter, so I'm only showing 2 examples. You might build 4 or 5 or 6. There's some athletes I have like 5 or 6. I try never to do that, but I might, because of the events or what they're doing, it's important to me. So what I'm always looking at is that tight cluster to the 2-year range. Whenever that number's positive, you're probably pretty ready to race. I got a question on how I built the FTP CTL. I sent out the charts. Just look at the equation. It's a pretty complex cross function. So I'm simply just using the cross function to do that. But if you sync, the charts will be in your chart library. I gave you this chart. It's called Road Race Report. Just open it and take a look at the equation. The next thing I do, and I've showed this chart before, and it's funny, I almost feel bad, like I don't have a ton of new stuff to show, but the reality is I actually use the stuff I show, so it's hard to just create new. I think clusters are important, and the more I use them, the more I see it being relevant for a high activity racer, meaning is a cluster important for somebody who's doing 1 or 3 big events a year? Probably not so, even though I think it still would be insightful if they were riding hard. If an athlete who's got, is going to be racing 40 times a year, clusters are pretty important, in that sense. Racers that have 1 or 2 super big events, a big stage race, a grand tour, something like that, again, clusters are really important because their training will be doing, they'll be racing, training, and preparation, and their ability to begin to cluster is a good indicator of form to me. I usually want this cluster to begin to range in the 95% or above, and then I feel pretty good that the athlete is ready to race, assuming we're going hard, that they're hard efforts. You could ride on your trainer all winter long, right, and get 95% above if you never go hard, but assuming they're testing and racing and riding hard, I want that to be 95% or above. Here we're seeing that they're 20 and 5 minute, and you could use 1 minute like I had before, is not very well clustered. In the last 30 days, we're not seeing them being able to put together a bunch of peak time ranges together. So I'm really showing a bad example, which actually helps. But yet, at the NP side, they're doing okay. But I can tell you the reality is it's because this athlete isn't riding hard yet. They're actually working through an injury recovery scenario, so there's more to it. We see that those clusters, once going peak, the tighter they get, the better the form tends to be. Remember, that's an opinion and there's no absolutes, but it's something I observe. This is just a simple MMP in yellow. This is a normalized power MMP, and I'm just running some peaks in here, so no big deal. I use this chart all the time. I'm looking at VO2 max over the 30 days. It's really hard when you're looking at it in 30 days. I will often back out to longer if I see something odd in the VO2 max. And the same, I'm looking at aerobic efficiency. I don't use heart rate numbers at a specific level, but I do like to look at them at a high level. This tells me something. If you notice the aerobic efficiency is declining, someday I need to do a heart rate and presentation and kind of explain why that can happen. But this is data. So if you look at it kind of back, that is my race readiness package. I try not to make it too complex. Here is all the reports I have for road race readiness or for a classic road racer. I don't try to go too deep. I just want to understand their background and their ability, or, what environment, where is their status on race day. I do have slightly different. I'll look at some things, let's say for a stage racer. So here's a stage racer. Again, not the right time of year, but you have the same functions going here. So build, rest, build, longer build, 1 week build, rest. So you clearly see this is just sort of a training cycle. Quick review here of numbers, same numbers you see, but higher CTL, resting in the same kind of phase, some high volume rides. Again, no real intensity for this athlete. There's a reason, but same slope. It's funny, the two athletes I picked were in rest cycles. Remember, the target's just a plug number till I set it. Pretty good training month, and there's a little bit of a negative slope going on for this month. Good kilojoules. Power at VO2 max, again, no change. Kind of, trust me, it works. There literally is no change. I should have picked an athlete with change. And some small amount of model change happening here. This athlete's peaks tend to come around their top 10, around 120 TSS a day, and they're positive ones. So you see two athletes kind of peaking right around that 0 range. 1 minute peaks, 418 is their 30-day peak, 379 is their cluster, 431 is their 2 year, so they're off on the 1 minute. And the 2 minute or the 20 minute is down to around 233 versus 272, so they're off on the 20 minute. So just some numbers to think about. Same reality, same numbers, a little better clustering because this athlete also isn't riding that hard. Similar VO2 max. That's funny. I didn't quite think about that. So the reality is that's a different, different type of athlete. You might be tracking different things, but some similar results. So here's a trick what I do, right? Because I run all those charts on a 30-day, and I do this in different ways, and a bunch of people was going around in the Facebook group the other day were sort of asking this question. I then take screenshots of those, just like I did here, just these, and I save them in TrainingPeaks. You click the little file button right here, and it'll ask you to upload a file, and then I save them there. This way, I always have them, and the athlete and I can always share them. And the athlete themselves, if they leave you or they go on their own, which happens as we all know, they do still have the benefit of having that data. I think it's important that coaches understand that it's your intellectual property, but it is the athlete's data, and sharing it with them there is good. It also, when you start reviewing races and you've done the same race for 2, 3, 4 years, it makes it easy to go back and say, hey, I want to take a quick look at that status. All you would have to do is click on any one of those blue files and it opens the chart. So that is a pretty good way to do it. We're actually going to take a look at this race, even though it's misspelled there. We're going to take a look at this race here as the race review. Okay. So now let's talk about the race review. I have steps I do here. First step 1 is I prep segments. So it's funny. Here's a good note for you. My athletes have a love-hate relationship with this. So if I'm not at the race or I'm not at the event and I'm watching on TV, I will either text them or Skype coach them. So I'll text coach them or I'll Skype coach them. And then they can come back later and think about, how you replay events in your head. You're like, oh, I was racing. I remember this. I remember that. I was climbing here. And then when they're writing their notes, you can actually go back through my texts and think about what I was saying. But actually, I do it for a deeper reason than that. It actually tracks time. If you think about both those are timed. So text has a time you sent the text, and Skype has a time. And, I wouldn't do this for all races, don't get me wrong, but all bigger races. Then I go back and I'm able to look at what my own notes are, and that's how I create my segments, which I'll show you in a moment when I look at a race file, because I've gotten in the habit of saying, this was important, it needs to be a segment. I almost take notes to myself. But then my athletes can go back after the race, and as they're thinking through, if I'm not there and can't say, hey, here's some feedback, they actually have the feedback in timed. Oh, I was only 20 minutes in. I can see that. I was an hour in here. So it kind of funny little thing. The environmental data, then I build graphs, then I review a graph and matches. I don't have a complex system of the actual race review. I tend to get complex in all the data around it at times when I get wrapped into it. And don't forget, the most important data you can track is, did you win? How well did you do? So don't forget performance and all of this. It's kind of funny, you have all this science, but the art in the review of the race really matters here. Cycling is so dynamic. You really can't break it down to the numbers. The numbers only help us understand it. I mean, you can clearly, but it helps us understand it better. All right, so here's my road race review package. I loaded it. I think the name was called Road Race Review. I'm pretty sure. I'm sure it'll show up here on one of the screens. This is my it's a parent-child chart. When you open it, it looks like that. I probably could have put that first. And it's called Road Race Review. What I do is I start with this chart because it's got a bunch of simple things I want in it. And this is where I begin to segment the effort. And I don't want a lot of data in there. I just want to know what I might segment on. So what I'm looking at here is purple is temperature, an environmental piece of data, right? Power, assuming they have power. This gray, and I use a shaded gray with shaded black so I can really see it, is elevation, right? But what I also do up here to remind myself to check is I have start elevation and start temperature. So how I end up reviewing the race, if the start elevation is maybe 3,000 feet, and then I see things like this, versus 3 feet is different. This is Northern Europe racing. You don't have a lot of big climbs up there. So the reality is you're not going to have it. But I want to know if this athlete if I see it down here and there's big elevation changes, I want to it zones me in on the elevation. If I see a whole bunch of gray, that zones me in too, the elevation. And same with temperature. I see it started around 50 degrees, but classic Garmin, they actually started this race indoors. This is a Drenthe, however they say it. And they actually had to start inside because it was kind of cold and rainy. And then they got out to a slower neutral start. But then I want to look at the temperature. In this particular race, it's interesting to note the temperature is low, but I don't necessarily adjust my review dramatically on that. The start elevation was low, and there's just not a lot of elevation change. You can see these two. This is the same climb. They go over twice the Ramberg through the race. I made segments by what this athlete was doing. So you can see my segment here is WFT to climbs. WFT doesn't mean anything bad. It means working for team. Sometimes as a professional racer, that's your job. You're working for the team. You're covering brakes. You're hauling water bottles. Depends on what your job is, but you're doing something. I then segmented out these two climbs. We knew that they'd be a challenge. They absolutely created some scenarios in this race. And I just segmented them up, meaning I just dragged a range, named it climbs over it, so that as I start to look at it, I can look at those specifically. And then this athlete got caught in a crash coming down. She didn't crash, but she got caught behind the crash, spent a block of time chasing in here. The chase kind of settled down, and then there was another push really here to get at it. So I just took this section as the chase. So I have 3 major segments I have in here. The working for the team to the climbs, she had a very specific job, the climbs themselves, and then the chase after the crash. No, I should probably name that chase after crash so I remember 2 years from now, but I know it. I run in my parent-child a very simple report. I'm just looking at ride time and basic data here to get started. I just want to see, the basic, what are the facts? It's the Joe Friday approach. I'm sure there's very few people as old enough to remember Joe Friday, but just the facts. Wait a minute, I think Dean's on here. He's old enough to know. Yeah, he's in there. So the reality is just some basic information I use in the report. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, and everybody builds their own report. as I start going across the bottom here, I'm going to just go right to left. I try to cut this out so I can make my reports bigger. So I'm going to go right to left. The first thing I do is I use my race intensity report, and this is simply doing it by eye levels where red is hotter and green-blue is cooler. So obviously the levels go up as you get hotter. And what's happening here is you can quickly see that this was a pretty classic Euro spring, Northern Europe, in the gutter, over the cobbles, kind of tough race. Really tough here early. I know this athlete was doing some break chasing and doing some work and was trying, you know, moving through the pack was definitely challenging because it was also raining and wet. So a lot of work there. You can immediately see there's a higher density. Here you can see the two climbs. There is elevation going on back there. And then you can see this, there was a little bit, everybody kind of let off a little in between. Here she kind of was coming down, coasting, and here is where the crash occurred. You saw this frantic, get a small group back together, organize, 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 and then you see a chase. So, you know, pretty good intensity view. I am running a slope here of power. The slope you see, and I'm using watts per second. So the slope was a negative slope. So this athlete was losing a little bit of power, and you can kind of see it. And I could normally just run a trend line through here. I do it in other, but I don't do it here. But I want to know the slope. The reason I run this as a parent-child is the top chart is highlight and everything in the bottom is zoom. So as I start looking at segments, so here you see I'm looking at the work for the team segment, she was pretty flat. She was losing a little bit of power, but she basically, this is that segment now zoomed in, so the slope has reconfigured, so has the time in zones, right? So I'm using, so I can look at that segment. So she did a fair amount of work working for the team. The average power wasn't that high at 184, you know, 217. There's some digs in here, but that's not killer high. But it was high tension, wet, nervous, sketchy, tricky stuff, you know, with some tough moves. And there was a slight loss of power. Here is the chase segments. And I didn't put the climbs because I used it as an example later. You can see the red, you know, you can see it's not as frequent, but it's harder. So what do you think she's doing? Working in a small group, right? So you can kind of see what she was pushing when she could. But look, the NP overall wasn't that high. The average power was a little high because there wasn't as many efforts. But you can see in the end, they were digging harder to try to get there. So it gives you some just a good visual picture of the race, and they were now, she's starting to fade. She's definitely losing some watts in this section. Now, similar but different, the next report is matches and levels, and I changed the color of matches also than what most of it is, where I use red as pure Pmax, and then I just go down through the list. Red to orange to yellow to green to blue, which is still FTP, so you know you're still seeing some stuff. And you see matches being burned. So very similar to intensity, but what I do want to separate out here is I do like to look at what kind of kilojoules they're burning. I'm running two lines here. I'm sure they're hard to see. There is elevation here. You can see it up here in the index, in the legend. And there's also cumulative work. So cumulative work. Somebody already sent a question how that it doesn't work. So it does. So cum sum, C-U-M, S-U-M is the function. And if you use the word cum sum parentheses work, it won't work. But a watt is a watt and a kilojoule or a joule are the same thing. So just use watts and use 1,000 to make it kilojoules, and you'll get the same equation. So you're just looking at how it builds. So you can see it gets a little steeper. The climbs are in here. I know you can't see them as well. And then there's a lot of fatigue. And as that fatigue kind of gets over these kind of points, right, we definitely see she can't burn as bright. And you could zoom in. I just didn't want to sit here and do it. Everybody knows how to zoom and things like that. And you'll get a very good insight of the change. She burned a lot more matches here than she did here. And just she was running out of gas. It just was what it was. I look at QA in a couple of different ways for racing. I don't think many people look at it like I look at it, but I do. The reality is, can anybody hear me? I got 1 or 2 reports of a sound loss. Everybody hear me all right? Yep. Okay, cool. Sorry. Yeah, we've gotten so many storms out here. It's crazy. So what I'm looking for is I want to keep this red pretty low. This is our low cadence, high force, and I'm accumulating. So again, I'm using the cum sum total over time. And I want this rider, obviously, not that you can't put out power with low cadence, high force, but it's got some extra taxing to it. It's kind of funny. Here you see her in the climb. She kind of plotted the climbs a little bit. She always does. And might have cost her a little bit more, but then kind of settled in, didn't raise too much after that. You actually can follow here where she was doing some good Q3, keeping that cadence high and rolling along when she needed to because she was surviving in the chase group as best she could when she wasn't working. Pretty good spread of numbers here. I like seeing that. Q3 is great if you're doing well. You can also do a lot of Q3 laying off the back and missing the time cut. But the reality is, that's a pretty good number, pretty good break. I also like looking at the quadrant analysis with power lines. And, this also will show us some quadrant breakdown. You can see them here. This is where power lines to give me some insight of what they are. Again, because the pictures don't always pick up the index, I should always make sure. One of the things I like to see is the egg shape. So one of my ways of just visual identification, because I'm challenged, is I think about this report, I look for the egg. When the egg is standing on its tip, I feel better, it depends on how tight that egg is, about the athlete's pedaling and cadence. And when the egg is laying on its side, I'm not happy with that athlete's pedaling and cadence. So if you think about it, what I'm looking at is the athlete using their gears to maintain cadence, or are they adapting their cadence to the gear? When the egg is like this, they're using their gears to adapt to cadence. When the egg is like this, they're using their cadence to adapt to the gear. So just a little bit of insight of something you're looking for there. I use VAM when I'm looking specifically at climbs. Now here, these are shorter, punchy, too short for VAM. Well, I don't know, sort of right there. But I still have it in my packet and I want to see climbing speed. So here I just kind of take a look at her 5-minute climbing speed without descending. She was close to 1266. That's pretty solid, considering it was halfway through the race and everything else. Here being a little shorter, you can see they look pretty similar efforts of what she was doing. So if this was like a single off climb, we'd get a little more. So Robert Smith asked a really good question. Sorry, Robert, I didn't even say your name that loud, but is the pedaling belief specific to road racing? Would mountain bike egg shape be the same? That's a great question. I am showing a road race. Mountain bike is so tough, right? Because you end up with more quadrant 3 pedaling. You definitely have to apply a lot more force at times. But I would answer back, that becomes more of a terrain specific answer than it does just universally for mountain bike. Yes, you tend to see the scatter more in a mountain bike, but the reality is you have to really think about the terrain. You can get some pretty interesting clusters with really hard courses. You'd actually end up with you can end up with like egg and an egg. It's kind of hard to explain, but no, this is probably, my point was more specific to road and road and mass start kind of racing and sort of time trialing to a degree, but I'll talk about time trialing in a second. So let's look at the same, looking at a TT review. Here's just a master's racer building. Remember, I would always, before I look at these, I'm looking at the race environment. So basically what we see here, this is my TT review. Again, I'm just not that complex, and I need to remember to click on the screen before I take pictures so you can see some numbers. But here's what I look at for time trial. So I'm looking at elevation in the background, speed, power, and a simple linear regression line on power. I'm looking at their average power for the race, watts per kilogram, average speed, normalized power, and percent of threshold. The number of times, it's funny, I get asked this question all the time. Most good time trialists time trial over threshold. Not a lot over threshold, but over threshold. I'm looking at their cadence. Here's what's funny with Robert's question there. This guy is a plotter, man. He just loves and chews up low cadence. Look, high force, low cadence, 97% of the time. We're working on that to some degree, but he definitely likes to do it. This is an older race from a couple of years ago. Now, this is actually, this was from 2 years ago. I use the map in my TT because I often want to create, remember my first step is to create segments. I often want to create segments on a map basis. So I'll create those segments on the map basis. I created an out and back, but didn't put it in this picture. But the reason I did the out and back was just to make an example. This actually turned out to be a point-to-point race once I picked it as an example, but I did do it like out and back, which I'm going to show you here. So that's all I'm using the map for. I have a simple TT report. Again, I don't like to put too much data in my initial race reviews because I get lost in the data. I just want the facts, and then I like to see things visually. So then I move to this same intensity work, intensity and slope, the same as I would on a road race. So this is pretty cool view. You really see this, right? You can see here, right, that this athlete was gaining power. This was a pretty well executed time trial with the potential and how you feel about that. But look what happens when we look at it as an intensity review. They rolled this out perfect in a lot of ways, right? They didn't start too hard. They get themselves rolling. You do see a little hill here, so they hit, and this is Florida, so that's maybe an overpass. So they give a little surge, but then they're laying in. They didn't even surge as hard the second time over a little climb, and then just slowly they built steam. They just kept building. That's pretty well done. So you get an excellent, and here, look at that nice, they're making fatigue in a time trial or building work in a time trial, nice, steady, linear. I know you guys on the screen can't see the time and zones, but it's very good. And the slope here, they're positive. I did put the percent on time trial. I do look at it as, but I didn't. So it's actually watts per second. Remember that if you're using my chart pack, correct that to watts per second. So the reality is they're gaining power throughout at a pretty reasonable slope. Well executed, you can see it right away. I did break it down to the out and back, so if I want to zoom in, I can see what they're gaining here in the out. Everything else looks the same because he did it so well, where, look, he was gaining 0.068 watts per second, and then here he's a little less. So he gained a little more as he rolled through the out than he did on the back, but that's because the fatigue was laying in, but that's pretty impressive, and might actually suggest he didn't go hard enough at the start. He might have been a little faster. Then to compare, I have what is called the trends. You actually have a trends in the road race one too. I just didn't show it because I didn't want to show doubles of everything and attempt to make a time constraint that I never ever make. And you can see they're out and back positive trendings, and here's that slope combination. You can see their speed, they were pretty steady across. They lost a little on the back, and again, it really wasn't an out and back, so maybe they picked up a little wind. I'm sorry, they gained a little on the back, they lost a little on the out. It makes perfect sense with the power. Their cadence, if it's feasible, you can see the negative here on the back. They started losing a tiny bit of cadence late in the game. You can see the negative here. The dash, you got to be careful, of one dash. So the dashes, see it dash, that's the end of the title, the end of the expression name. And then here is negative 0.0. So they lost a little cadence going out. So Paul, yeah, got it. So that's what's happening there. So, but basically a pretty well executed time trial, and you see the, numbers. That's kind of at the core. There are other things I do, and I didn't put in here. I've got to be honest. I don't want to play coy. I didn't put it in here in the end screen. I thought I had, but I use Dean's power at speed chart. I call it number 2 only because I changed the colors because I like to be, he's got more flair than me with color. I'm a little more plain. excellent chart. I really should have showed an example, but it is in the pack. And it really gives you some good insight of the effects of what could have happened with improved aerodynamics and stuff like that. So take a look at that. I like to use that back sometimes to my athletes in time trial and in road racing. It applies to both, as long as the efforts are reasonably steady, type of deal, but more so in time trial. So it just gives us some insight of targets. I'm sorry, I missed that slide. My final slide, I just put it on here because I did invent this joking with an athlete. I don't know, this has been around for a while. It's just being funny is, you can always take all your work and translate it into what I do here is cheeseburger, beer, and pizza. If you do enough work, you can get a lot of each. So if you're, I don't know which this is. Oh, this is from the female Euro Pro. After the race, she could have eaten 6 cheeseburgers, 9.2 slices of pizza, or 18.4 beers, and had broken even on the energy utilization. So that's my presentation tonight. Just a little overview of process. I got a lot of really great questions while I was rolling. I have a feeling I missed one or two. There was a point or two there. They were kind of coming fast. But if you have questions, now is the time to ask. Like I said, these files are loaded. Wow. So I have an athlete doing a mountain bike time trial. It's, again, let's say you're saying a mountain bike time trial. And I assume because of where it is and where I missed it, I assume you're talking about the cadence chart that I had up there, the egg. My goal would be to attempt to test it. But yeah, I would. Let's say it's a time trial where you're running, a fast bike and no suspension, and you don't see a lot of terrain habits. You do preserve some muscular. The lower your cadence, the more force you're pedaling with, the more you're shifting some of the load to your muscular side versus your aerobic side. And I know everybody generally knows that. And that is an oversimplification. But it's not a bad one. It gives you some good insight. A lot of times the force pedaling in mountain biking really comes more about terrain and how are they handling rock gardens and things like that, blah, blah, blah. There's a little more to it than just an easy answer. That being said, I come from the mountain bike race side, and I remember the last team I raced on, we had a junior team too, and part of the job was to teach juniors. And I used to criticize juniors. I'd watch them race, and they would never shift. They would just power everything out. And I'd be like, man, you juniors never shift enough because you're lazy. Now that I'm, nicely into my 50s, and when I ride my mountain bike and my road bike, you know what? I don't shift enough either because I'm lazy. So it's kind of like early in life, late in life, we get out of the habit of shifting. For all the people in the middle, racing hard and having fun, shifting is a good thing. And knowing how to use gears to achieve efficiency, and again, an oversimplification at that point is pretty important. It's just not, my egg thing is just a generalization for road racers, but it is really relevant in your thinking. Okay, I think I have all the questions. If there are any, just post them in the Facebook group. I'm going to put this up fast because there was a lot of people here and a lot of people signed up. All right, everybody, thanks. Have a great night.